My thesis is an exploration of material transformation. I spent the first semester investigating material object definitions and boundaries in order to explore what broader tensions and areas of inquiry were suggested. My final projects last semester took an in-depth look at the mechanical relationships within pick and pull. For those not familiar, pick and pull is a junkyard for wrecked or non-functional cars. I began the project by photographing discarded mechanical parts that I'd collected, observing how the components interacted and connected, and exploring those schisms in 2D and 3D. For our final independent project, I began by documenting the findings I'd been gathering from pick and pull. Initially, I created a book and a website to categorize all the information, but I felt as if I was organizing, not making. This groundwork, however, gave me a playground to pull from. I began to experiment, zooming in to pixelate imagery, collaging together images of different cars. This process resonated. It was the digital version of the physical act, cobbling together components of different machines in order to make a whole. I felt these final collages summarized my overall experience with pick and pull. Machines not quite matching up, but close enough to function. This semester, I intended to use my same methodology and approach, but shift my focus to a different area, the lumber industry. This area of inquiry is part of my heritage. My dad has worked in the lumber industry for over 40 years. My grandfather worked in a sawmill, as did both of my great-grandparents. My work this semester can be categorized as a series of experiments. I'll go into each of them in detail, but for the sake of clarity, here's a brief breakdown of the areas I've been working on and in. I've been looking at the sawmill, Home Depot, and the history of the logging industry, and I've been experimenting with wood frames, wood type, and acrylic forms. So now we begin. Part 1, the sawmill. I began by taking a tour of the sawmill, which I was able to do with the help of my dad. One of the first thoughts that struck me when we drove into the plant was the sheer magnitude of the operation. The visit bordered on overwhelming. I wanted to see every part of the process and understand what each step of turning timber into lumber entailed. So I photographed. This first visit gave me a lot of visual material and started some great conversations between my dad and I, providing me with specific insights into this industry. Part 2, Home Depot. A few days after my visit to the mill, I went to Home Depot to observe the process of bringing the lumber to retail. I ended up in the plywood section and was surprised at the variety of composite wood available: indoor, outdoor, finishing, base, different thicknesses and different sizes. Every piece was crafted for a different purpose. I continued to the metal and steel aisle, trying to make mental notes of how and when metal and wood interacted within the walls of Home Depot. It was this thought that reminded me of a photo my dad had shared with me this past week, a close-up version of something I'd seen last weekend when I toured the mill. This image is from my original tour. This group of logs was set aside because metal was detected within them. When I initially asked my dad about this, he told me it's usually nails or barbed wire. This log, however, seemed to have ingested the nail. Someone, at some point, had stuck it into that tree, and the tree continued growing around it. This idea stayed with me, wood growing around metal, holding it in place. It seemed much different than the relationship we're used to seeing, metal cutting wood or metal holding wood together. Part 3, Westwood. After our mill tour, my dad lent me several logging books he'd collected over the years. Looking through them was helpful. I was able to see familiar aspects of what I'd toured in person. I decided to scan some of the images that caught my attention. These images are from a now-defunct mill in a town called Westwood, which, oddly enough, I visited 2 years ago. Both these found images and the ones I took of the mill feel very unfamiliar to me in terms of material. I wasn't sure how to process whole objects. Unsure of how to move forward, I brought them both into Photoshop, converted them to black and white, which I admit is my default, and began to compose. Alignments in the images began to emerge, and for the first time, I am curious. At Martin's advice, I make note of these moments and set them aside. Part 4, Wood frames. The act of juxtaposition is a technique I use often in my work. I picked up an old wooden window frame to experiment with after touring the mill, thinking at the very least it could provide a comparison of old and new wood. I began by documenting it entirely, keeping in mind a similar question of past projects: when is it no longer a window? During this process, I also remembered that I had a new, unused wooden picture frame from IKEA. It was the opposite of the wooden window, lightweight, fabricated of many tightly knit pieces, I wondered how much metal held it together, as opposed to the window frame. I carefully documented each object, trying to pay special attention to the joints. My plan was to strip the window down to the wood, but first I consulted with my dad about the construction of the window and of the frame.
The wood too, so it's short pieces of wood, and you take all the defect out, so there's no knots or anything, no blemishes, and then it's a certain size. Then you finger joint it back together, and it's pressed from each side, and there's glue in there, so it glues it back together to create one long piece of wood.
This surprised me, the notion that a collection of small, perfect pieces of wood was seen as more valuable or more desirable than a solid piece of wood with slight imperfections.
Basically, when people are doing this, they're upgrading a piece of wood. So they're cutting it. If there's a defect right here, they're cutting that piece out. And that's what creates these small pieces. And then they finger join them back together.
I kept this concept in mind as I continued to deconstruct the window. I hoped that taking down the window to its individual pieces would help me better understand its construction. The process of taking it apart was pretty satisfying. The window was held together by 6 nails, 4 on the bottom, which were easy to remove. Exposure to water had led to dry rot over the years. The 2 on the top, however, were incredibly difficult. Both top nails required multiple clamps, pliers, hammers, and awls to remove. Once I had 4 separate pieces, I took them to the studio to document them again. Looking at them again, under harsh lighting, through a macro lens, highlighted all the imperfections, the dry rot, the nail holes, the weathered wood grain, and streaks of leftover paint. I was reminded of the conversation I had with my dad about upgrading the wood to remove any imperfections. I began to wonder what would happen if I applied that same logic to this window frame. That is, remove any imperfection from it in order to upgrade it. I decided to start with one piece and see what happened. This is currently a project that's in progress. I've cut off the imperfect pieces and photographed them, and I'm currently in the process of building the upgraded replacement. Part 5, type. I was able to find a few orphaned letters of wood type at a local junk shop. I've been thinking of wood type since the second week of school, as Martin and I briefly discussed type and typesetting in relation to these collages I'd created over winter break. I didn't know how this type linked in, other than that it was made of wood, but I wanted to experiment with it regardless. Later, I came across Martin's cut letter series, and I wondered if a similar idea could translate physically with the wood type I had. With the help of my dad, I cut the letter into pieces. Originally, I thought I would stagger them and use a macro lens, similar to what I did here with From Studio work. However, when I went back into the studio to photograph, it didn't translate how I thought it might. At first, I spaced them out diagonally, then zoomed in, but nothing jumped out at me. I then laid them down flat, and this actually reminded me of a conversation I'd had with my dad about how a log is cut to get both vertical grain and flat grain. I played around with this idea, treating the type as pieces of cut lumber. This concept was more interesting to me than the images themselves. Part 6, Acrylic Explorations. This semester, I'm taking an undergrad photography class, and I'm using the class as a space to try and explore my thesis work. The current assignment for that class is based around using the color combinations RGB and CMY. I decided to use this as an opportunity to explore the relationship between acrylic and wood. I wondered how I might exaggerate the situation, the color, the light. I continued experimenting with blue and also red and green. I used both lumber and an uncut log. Again, nothing jumped out at me. I kept this experience in mind and continued working. For a month now, I've been experimenting and gathering material. I myself am curious how or if this all fits together. In an attempt to get back into my comfort zone, I printed out all the images from all these projects I've just shown you and started to lay them out. Though there were a few juxtapositions that appeared interesting, as a whole, the work felt chaotic and forced. I was fortunate to share this video with Martin as I worked on it, and he offered some impressions that I found extremely helpful. First, and I'm paraphrasing here, was that these collages were loud and just fine. It seems blunt, but he was right. It was honest feedback I needed to hear. When I look back at what I feel are successful design projects, seen here, the work is subtle. Which brings me to Martin's next comment, that my work often contains the theme of misalignment. It was a statement I myself made when presenting my pick and pull final from last semester, but an observation that hadn't occurred to me. But again, he was right. My most successful projects come about when I work quietly. So, moving forward, I intend to pare down my material, work slowly, and observe what is in front of me. Thank you.